Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. In this video I will be doing an in-depth analysis specifically regarding leftist ideology. And where might we see where leftist ideology becomes an indoctrination, which in understanding the indoctrination into the left, we can understand why people would want to vote right. Now, in terms of what we would consider indoctrination process of things, if you were to look at the schooling system, which yes, you're correct, school is actually meant to be of a leftist experience. And you might ask, well, why would we want to do that to our children if it's causing this much confusion within our system? Well, for one, you could argue that the idea behind leftist ideology is specifically not to teach how to think, but more specifically, what to think. And based on this particular analysis, well, then you, as an individual that is now leaving university, if you do not continue pursuing the education and begin as a teacher, where you never leave school, you would see yourself never pull away from the leftist ideology, which now when we look at the very teachers of universities preaching leftist ideology, they themselves are people that have not gone back into the world in order to get what is known as a perspective on the leftist ideology. In terms of leftist ideology, when you analyze it to its very fundamental core, which is to tell you what to think, not how to think, and the ability of learning what to think, you stimulate the aspect of intelligence, which is able to store the information. Now, regarding the ability to critically think, that ability in its own is entirely up to the individual person's development in their ability to critically think. So now if you were to imagine, say, we have a leftist-leaning ideology in our education system, which is teaching our children not how to think, but what to think. And based on what to think, we then see these university students come out of university telling the world this is what should be. But in their explanation of what should be, they list predominantly, well, based on what I was taught in university, this is what should be, which based on this particular observation, this is what the world should be. And then they get lost. Because essentially what ends up happening is the individual is stunted somewhere in this process. And in the stuntment of the process, we then see that they lack the ability to gain a perspective on how to think. Because somewhere there is a chemical imbalance being formulated. And the idea of understanding that based on the leftist ideology, I am then meant to challenge the way the right works. In understanding the way the right works, you're not essentially meant to know as a left-wing university student having graduated. You're not supposed to know, okay, at 21 years old, I officially know how to rule the world because I had a university education. No. And the understanding that you are now 21 after finishing either a university education at 21, 22 if you receive a bachelor's, you would then see, based on this bachelor's, that you simply gained what to think based on now what you must formulate into how to apply it. So if I was to teach you of a wrong perspective, your entire education system, upon leaving the education system and you finding out that the system you were taught is not the one that is applied, you would have to question the current system, resulting in logical processing, which in logical processing of logical intelligence, we see a pull away from leftist ideology, which is of a emotional leaning intelligence. And in the leftist part of things, where we now see that it is actually meant to cause you to think how to change the world, not what the world should be. Which in this notion, we are seeing our children are entering a hyper-fixated state of mind regarding leftist ideology, because they are so fixated upon the ADHD medication of amphetamines we specifically put them on in order for them to gain a slower processing of their thought process in their breaking down of the actual material they are absorbing. You see, a ADHD medication, essentially the way ADHD works is based on the initial impulse of the teaching. It is not that the student is not able to maintain the rhythm at which the material is being taught. ADHD is a attention deficit disorder, which means based on the particular initial striking point of the attention stimulus, you then see the child is more intelligent. And in its intelligence, in its logical way of thinking, you would then actively see you can take a logical child, which is gaining a logical perspective, it's learning on its own, and in its attention deficit of breaking down the subject to a deeper level, in its own level of understanding at its particular age, you would then see that the child is then grown into a more logical or more emotional way of thinking in its intelligence. And the more we challenge one side of the brain, well, eventually, when you reach adulthood, we realize there's poorly developed human brains all of a sudden walking through society. And they are coming in the form of newly developed university students. Because we are constantly triggering the emotional state of students now. And the understanding of how emotional intelligence works, if I stimulate too much emotion in an individual, which could be such as striking fear, relaying my own internal guilt and fears upon the individuals that which I am teaching in order for them to enter my own predicament. And in the understanding of this particular predicament, you might feel some anger towards me now. Because you might say, well, how come you are teaching me how to think? And I might answer to you, well, how come you're approaching me angry at me for teaching you how to think, but you're not mad at your teachers you spent thousands of dollars on that are not teaching you how to think? I'm not teaching it to you for free. And this particular notion, I suggest you retract that particular statement. Because let's get to the meat of things, if you wish. Now that we see that we are not able to know how to create a critical thinking process, how do we reverse the emotional intelligence? Well, you would see in the business model of things, if you create a mental breakdown or a trigger point of poorly developed mental states of university students, you can actively say you have degenerated an entire generation because they are so triggered based on the emotional standpoint that in their ease of triggering, they become less logical, more unstable. And then we see how they might think, well, we know what the world should be. You were taught what the world should be. That's not how it should be in itself. Because in understanding what the world should be, you're meant to approach it from the perspective of comparing. Which, if the idea of the leftist ideology is of a euphoric or utopia, a heaven-like system where nobody has to work except the one maintaining the system. And then you see in the rightist ideology where you see everybody has to work so that we can create one system. And in the lack of accepting to work, we see the lack of acceptance in the attitude of the particular individuals and their ability to specifically, critically think, to logically think, to gain a greater perspective above, which we are seeing now in the education of these young particular individuals, such as university students or high school students. We're seeing a rise in proclivities regarding either, and I'm not going to be placing this guilt here, but we see a rise in the dehumanizing aspects of their now human experience as they enter the world going forward. And if the idea of being a good creator is the idea behind giving a similar weight to the cross, that which you yourself experienced, but in understanding the basis of fundamental human measure of character, you would then see that the more I display or displace my guilt or fear upon the rest of the world, the less I am able to withhold it, or if I do not hold the fear of guilt, then the rest of the world would experience it. And if I have a greater rate at this particular exchange, then you would say I have a poor measure of character, which in the analysis going into this particular notion, we are seeing a big rise in a lack of the actual development of character, specifically because we are not seeing the ability of children to be able to balance back out. Now you might say, well, that just sounds like an extremely sad experience for the children in general. Possibly. Was that not the way you were brought up yourself? So where did it go wrong in this generation? Well, you could say that whether you were 20 years ago or maybe slightly more, we would see that there was a rise in the change in psychiatry within those last 20 years. We saw a rise in such things as ADHD treatments, newly depression treatments, on and on and on and on, which in the business model of things, if I can create now a breaking down or a stimulus which causes individuals in their system of life to experience a breakdown, which in the result of this breakdown, I can now create a model regarding a system regarding benefiting myself, selling you a prescription of chemical to rebalance out what I think should be ultimately the way you are meant to develop, until you develop into what I tell you to develop and you no longer know what you are developed as, and now I tell you how you develop. It sounds like an oddly sick and twisted approach, this, doesn't it? But yet this is the common model of the economic system, which is under capitalism. If I may create a increase in the demand of a product, I may now increase its selling point and control its price, which increases my level of revenue. To which you might say, well, it sounds like the pharmaceutical industry has been just lying to us regarding this at this particular point. which, yeah, they have been. Because in terms of the actual side effects that you see arise in physiological perspectives caused by medication meant to treat the psychological process through a physiological process known as a medication, in changing the physiological process, such as the body's process itself, you would see you are changing perspectives of your body, known as its natural processes, based on a stunting and stimulus process. And in the stunting or stimulus process, you would then see where you have been stunted and where you have been developed. And you can see this in all different types of areas. The question we now see is, in which direction are we seeing ourselves being grown as humans? Because if we're being told, based on that side effect, I will give you another medication that gives another side effect, which based on this development, I will give you another medication, which creates another side effect. And you eventually see that we are literally being made at this particular point into what these side effects are meant to make us experience. Which means this is becoming our dehumanizing experience. And then we might wonder, well, how did the Nazis specifically were able to create human experimenting to the depths that they were within the Auschwitz working camp? Well, you might wonder how we are making things work in the Canadian working camp. Which, welcome to the official, true, what is known as a legitimate Nazi. An individual that is willing to create an experimentation based on your experience in order to see just what the hell happens. Crazy, right? Now, how do we get rid of these individuals? Well, for one, we have to expose them. Which is not just in a conspiracy theory effort, because guess what? If you yourself cannot see this truth, I would argue you have been essentially assimilated into leftist ideology. Which now, if you are unable to see the truth behind this particular statement, you might say, well, you might sound like a right-wing or red pill man at this particular point. To which I would say, yeah, hello, look at your current state. And in your basis of what the world should be, you don't see how this is wrong. Because you do not have a logical perspective. You have not developed a perspective, a logical, intelligent experience. And if you seek to further push in the direction of the left, we enter a further and further more dehumanizing experiment in the aspect of things, which communism in itself is the last effort to understand at which rate you can control a population. It is a structure of sorts. But in the web-like mechanism, also known as a pyramid, which, let's break down the communist system for a second. In the right-wing ideology, we see the idea behind a pyramidal structure of a hierarchy, which a leader is at the top, and we then see the downward progression or lineage separate in the grab of power, if you wish. The further down the pyramid you are, the less power you have. The further up the pyramid you are, the more power you have. But now we generated a system we considered a web-like mechanism, which from a point is a networking person, which other points within the network may network based on this networking process, based on this central networking individual, you would then see that there's more equality in the idea that networking generates equality and equity and blah, 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 to which I would argue, based on your central networking point, I can grab that point in your web, pull it up, and you still have a pyramidical structure. Which means, in the idea of your understanding of what to think, you are not learning how to think. Or you're not learning how to apply how to think to yourself. And you might say, well, life is hard, I should be taught everything. And it's like, whoa. Yeah, life is hard, but no, you should not be taught everything. It's called a book. If we were to teach you everything, well, then we would not be approaching psychology in Canada based on one particular psychologist's analysis of a more leftist-leaning psychology. You would be teaching all different books of psychology in order to generate a more complex way of thinking, but we specifically only teach one particular book of psychology, which is of a leftist-leaning ideology. And in the understanding of creating a business model, which now if we implement not just the idea behind feeding the chemical, but the ones implementing at which we use the chemical rates, we are fixing these people based on their warping of their understanding. You would actually see that the doctors themselves are of a leaning ideology themselves, which is benefiting the system's way of making money. Have you noticed nowadays that when you speak to a doctor, it's not really a doctor anymore, it is simply a drug dealer? Which you would go, doctor, I hit my knee and now I have pain in my wrist. And the doctor would say, okay, based on my observation, the doctor has pain in his knee, resulting in pain in his wrist. Here's the medication and prescription. Go try this out for 7 days. Come back. If you have any side effects, please let us know and I will write you another prescription. And this is what is now the doctor. We are no longer seeing doctors actively seeking to treat through medical care. We're seeing doctors treat through prescribing care. Medications based around a pharmaceutical system, we can generate money the more we put people on pills. And so, in the name of Auschwitz, how easily was it to popularize enslaving and creating a testing method to begin creating business models around understanding how we can affect human life, not just psychologically, physiologically, and change the patterns at which we can essentially change its dehumanizing in its pillar of spiritual experience, resulting in essentially as depopulizing the earth if you are not of this teaching. Where are the Nazis? Well, let's analyze where we might see an easily triggered enough individual that they would be able to then, based on listening to a video or a podcast or reading a book, we will then see that through the use of propaganda, such as the previous listed forms of expression, we will then see that according to how the news is controlled and how the political values are taught and how we apply these values in the teachings, on and on and on and on, resulting in ultimately propaganda, which in the propaganda aspect of things, if we now look at how we can manipulate an entire generation of people to go from school to then go to university campuses where if somebody says something that doesn't resonate with their particular what the world should be, these people, these individuals are now at the point in their emotional distress disorder that they are willing to go bang. And in this particular analysis, we must find the root cause of this particular distress. Some of you may argue it would be the drugs we have changed within our systems, such as the medications. Some of you might argue that it is based on the teachers that never left university in order to discover themselves, resulting in them passing down a leftist-leaning ideology back to the student. But I would argue that the true fundamental issue at hand is not in just the medication or the teaching, but in the combination of other factors ultimately resulting in what is known as the development of the child into a young adult. If we see that there is a lack of development from both logical and emotional intelligence, and we solely focus on one, we then see a stunting in the opposing force of the child, which then results in a poorly developed mental capability of being able to not be triggered by the world. And in this instability, we then see where we arrive here today. So how do we fix that? Well, you're meant to learn to know what to think. So based on what you know, I would invite you to then begin formulating how to think, which is to challenge what you were taught, which means you have to do your own research. You have to push the evolution further. That is the beauty of leftist ideology. It is meant to create a point of evolution from. A pivoting point, for example, where I can actively say from here, I can actively go here based on one pivot. And then these drastic change of a minor degree in the downward lineage, we all of a sudden see a drastic potential change at the outcome level of the path society could go into, which at the drastic percentage change of a degree we have just changed, we are now heading in a negative trajectory in our path of evolution. And so, to the Canadians of the world watching, or to anybody of the world watching, if you are now to see these particular system values being reflected within your civilization, also known as your society, I would argue it is time you start challenging what that system should be. Because we had a pretty damn good system up and running until you decided to challenge and wreck it all up. Thank you.